Welcome to Elephant in the Room, a podcast featuring real conversations with real therapists on the elephant in every room, trauma. With this show, we are aiming to share insights from professional practitioners on trauma, its impacts, as well as various modalities and resources on healing for survivors. This podcast is produced by the Breaking Free Foundation, a Canadian registered charity that supports trauma survivors in reclaiming their lives and finding healing. All of the therapists interviewed on this podcast are members of the Breaking Free Foundation Trauma Practitioner Network. My name is Amber Craig. I am a trauma survivor, one of the co-founders of the Breaking Free Foundation, and the proud host of this podcast. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Nicole Perry. Nicole is a registered psychologist at her private practice of embodied psychology in Edmonton, Alberta. She primarily uses somatic experiencing and somatic attachment-focused EMDR in her practice working with trauma. Please welcome to the podcast, Nicole. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So as always, I'm just going to let you kind of jump in and give us a little more background on your professional experience and the areas that you work in.
Yeah. Well, my background is actually in crisis work. And so I started very early on in the helping field, doing things like our local distress line and working in shelters. So kind of transitioned through nonprofit agency work into private practice, which I've now been doing for about 10 years. That these days is a mix of supervision, writing, and working one-on-one with clients. And yeah, as you said, I'm primarily working from a sort of somatic, experiential viewpoint with clients. And my main areas of specialty are shame resilience, setting boundaries, and healing trauma, which often go together.
Okay, and you also really exciting news. You recently wrote and published a book titled The Boundary Therapist. Can you share with our listeners what this book is all about?
Yeah, it's really a guide to sustainable practice for therapists that takes that same somatic and intersectional feminist approach. So, meaning rather than focus on what are the correct, ethical boundaries as defined by CPA to have with clients, we're more talking about how therapists, and I think helpers generally, can focus on their unique needs, their values, and how that can align with the work, how they approach the work, where they work. So throughout the book, I'll invite readers through gentle reflection to really get clear on what works for them and to have permission that that's allowed to work in a way that works for you.
And what would you say inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one a lot because when I look back over the last 10 years, many roads landed me here. But one thing I'll say is that in all the volunteer training, the 6 years of school, supervised hours, becoming a registered psychologist, I realized we didn't really learn about the topics of sustainable practice, boundaries, burnout, and vicarious trauma. The different signs and strategies that are research based. I learned about burnout and vicarious trauma by experiencing them firsthand. And I've heard that story far too often, where people are push and push and push until their body finally stops for them.
So I'm really excited to dive into this topic of vicarious trauma today with you because I think it's something that maybe gets overlooked when we talk about trauma. We're focused very much on the client that's approaching us for assistance, but even for us as an organization, we actually support a lot of people that are on the front lines, helping other people with trauma and dealing with their own. So, just to kind of start off this conversation, can you explain in a little more detail what vicarious trauma is?
Yes. And when I was first researching this to do some writing, even before the book, I realized that there's a lot of very similar kind of terms people use. Sometimes people talk about secondary traumatic stress, So the definitions are slightly different, but the one that I go with for vicarious trauma is that it can occur when we're exposed to stories that are difficult or disturbing, and then we become traumatized by those images and details. So in this way, the trauma that the one person experienced gets transferred over to us, and you also feel those effects. So in this way, I think about vicarious trauma as an occupational hazard, like you just mentioned with your different frontline workers. I see this a lot in healthcare, social work, shelters, settlement work, or frontline responders like firefighters, EMS, etc. And of course, in the book, talking about seeing clients through therapy, then we just know that you're more likely to take on the trauma of those you help. So it's that exposure to traumatic stories that I am talking about when I say vicarious trauma that activates our fight, flight, freeze, or other survival responses. And it shows up just the same in our nervous system as if we'd experienced that directly. At risk of saying this too much, it's that consistent exposure to traumatic stories that really does us in. And it can lead to a profound shift in our worldview, making people feel like the world isn't safe, that people are inherently evil, that trauma mentality can be taken on.
So you did sort of allude to a couple things there when you were just speaking about this, but if someone hasn't listened to any of our previous episodes and they're just, listening to this one, what would be some symptoms or signs that somebody is experiencing vicarious trauma? How would that show up in their body?
Yeah, we could think of it as very similar to direct trauma. And that would be including intrusive symptoms like nightmares, flashbacks, distressing memories, avoidance symptoms like having to avoid certain places or reminders, even certain memories and feelings. And then that kind of hyper arousal symptoms, meaning hypervigilant, like easily startled, irritable, or dealing with insomnia. And that's how I kind of think about trauma generally is a combination of intrusive symptoms, avoidance, and hyperarousal.
You did give lots of examples of people whose jobs would fall into this category of being high risk. Obviously, anyone who's working with the traumatized population could be at risk for this. Some things that we've seen, which people might not think of, is people who answer distress lines. We've had lots of those people reach out. We've heard stories of people who actually moderate content on social media sites experiencing this kind of vicarious trauma. Is there any
Mm.
other sort of profession that comes to mind that hasn't already been mentioned that could be at high risk for this?
Yeah, one that I hadn't thought about until I was reading more about it was researchers um, who might be hearing a lot of stories or maybe even seeing them written out. And I think especially so because, unlike therapists, when you're just taking in all those stories, you don't necessarily see that person survived and the resilience and the hope. You're just hearing about the worst moments of their lives.
Yeah, and as you're just mentioning that, it's making me think of people who serve on a jury as well in,
Yeah.
trials where they're going to have to look at very traumatic images or hear very traumatic stories. I mean, there's probably countless examples of where people might be exposed to it, but just to give people a bit of an idea of what that could look like.
Well, actually, if I could jump in, like
Yeah,
you're making me think of social media as well being another place. And interestingly, it's something that I often recommend for people who have a helping profession and see trauma in their work directly quite a bit, to not also watch the news or be exposed to that in your life outside of work, and which can be really hard for some people who want to stay involved and connected, but kind of looking at it as a sustainability practice of, okay, our bodies can only handle so much, so we have to be choosy about expose ourselves. Those images that can
yeah.
just stay in your mind, right?
I think it's a really good point for sure. I think there's certainly countless examples of things happening in the news and the world right now that people are have the option to be exposed to or not. So I think that's a good point. Um, for professionals who might be in one of those jobs that we just mentioned, what can they do to protect themselves against vicarious trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in a way, I'm going to start with what I think organizations and leaders can do, because sometimes those are the people who have more control. And what I've really learned is that the biggest risk is the amount of exposure. So, doing things for your staff, like reducing their client load, watching their client load to see how many trauma cases are they taking on, making sure that people are getting good breaks, or interspersing one-to-one trauma work with other types of work like admin, writing, etc. Um, so that could be one way, and it's something that some workers are able to advocate for themselves as well. But I would say that would be number one. And then if any listeners are in a leadership position, I would say it's super important to model that reduced client load, and ensured that the caseloads are revisited over time. Because sometimes, we don't become aware that things have really piled up for someone, unless they're uh, talking about it pretty loudly.
So if someone is listening to this podcast right now and they're thinking to themselves that this sounds really familiar and they might actually be dealing with some vicarious trauma, what are some things that they can do to cope with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. First step for me is often awareness, which is why I like doing podcasts like this, to sort of have people have that chance to reflect. And there's more formal ways to assess where things are at too. Completing certain symptom checklists to see, yeah, where am I at on burnout or vicarious trauma. Of course, I can't think of any of them at the moment, but I'll send them to you later. That could be a nice, even twice yearly type of thing. And then you could take that completed checklist to a trusted doctor or therapist and go over it together. But even nice as an insight tool in and of itself. Um, right. And I think the other thing that I run into in that awareness is lots of times, or maybe historically, I think times are changing, but people have said, well, I'm not completely burnt out, or I'm not, unable to function type of thing. Like they're waiting for it to get to a 10 out of 10 on that, the symptom list. So um, one of the other things we can do is kind of notice that it's a lot easier for our interventions to work when things are at a lower level. So catching the signs early, taking them seriously enough, and kind of giving yourself permission to intervene at that early stage will likely, result in less recovery time. Um, I have one thing in particular I could bring up. I don't know if that brought up any questions for you.
No, I think just keep going on this thread because I think this is a really important topic for sure.
Okay. So one of probably my favorite strategies to share for individuals is about the kind of empathy that you're using. And so what we've learned in the research is there's two different kinds of empathy. One is probably what most people think of, where we're stepping into the other person's shoes, we're imagining ourselves in their scenario, and trying to empathize that way. But there's another more effective approach that instead of putting ourselves in their position, we stay in our chair and sort of get curious. What could this person that I'm helping or sitting with, what could they be feeling? What's going on with them? And if we're having a hard time guessing, to ask. So it turns out that that type of approach ends up with people getting it right more often, like having more of a proper empathy and understanding your experience. And it also leads to less vicarious trauma, because instead of putting myself in those imagined scenarios again and again, where my body maybe doesn't know the difference between imagination and real life, I'm sitting back and realizing, or helping my body and nervous system, I should say, realize like I'm currently safe. This isn't happening to me in this moment. I'm sitting with the person who survived it and trying to notice what they might be feeling right here and now.
That's excellent. again, I think this is just a really important topic because I I I just think people that are doing a job that's helping other people through their trauma, like they tend to neglect themselves. And there's just so many examples of it. And I wish more people were seeking help around it. Is there anything else around the topic of vicarious trauma that you think is really important for listeners to know?
Um, well, just going back to, again, I think organizations and leaders have such a role to play. Another finding was that providing initial and ongoing training specifically about these topics of vicarious trauma is really important. And so, again, that may be something you can advocate for in your workplaces to recognize that, yeah, by nature of this being a risk factor of work, we need strategies and, ongoing support. So in terms of that ongoing support, I would also add it's important to have kind of proper debriefings. So many of my healthcare workers, they'll talk about the debriefings that they kind of have in the lunchroom, where someone, oh, I can't believe what just happened, and sort of starts to share these often horrific stories, um, which sometimes can be quite supportive to be able to, oh, me too, and this kind of experience. But often what we actually found is that now I'm not only carrying my stories from the difficult day that I had, but I'm carrying in great detail, and my nervous system is carrying my coworkers' stories. So people were leaving these sort of informal debriefings in a way that was overloading, overwhelming. So when I say proper debriefings, I'm talking about sort of consensual, structured approach to making sure people still get that support at work. And if I were advising someone how to do that, I would say, start with a grounding or resourcing activity that's led by someone, and you can rotate who's leading it, or could be, the facilitator. Then there can be room to bring up, how's feelings, how are we coping, right? To kind of have permission to maybe talk through, but starting with that sort of intention of what do we want out of this? And then ending it with a sort of grounding or connecting practice as well, so that anyone who's attending this kind of knows what they're getting into. It can prepare their nervous system to receive that, and the focus can be on the what do we need, what would be supportive, how do we go forward from here, kind of thing.
So you brought up a really great idea, which was for organizations and leaders to look into training around this for the workplace. Do you know of any resources or places where people get access to training like that?
Hmm. Okay, what I could speak to on that question would be just a good experience I had as a psychologist in private practice, where an organization had brought me in to do some initial training on these topics, but they also brought me back two more times at later points in the year. And I felt like that was probably one of the best experiences I had, because then those questions that might have been percolating could be asked. We were able to follow that train of, hey, we were talking about boundaries for a couple hours. What successes have you had? What with boundaries? What challenges? And so, having that touchstone rather than just, spending a whole bunch of your organization's money on like a one-time public speaking hour thing, can we make supports available ongoing, building relationships with a practitioner?
I think that's a great idea. Um, this has been extremely helpful, so I appreciate that. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to yourself, actually. Um, and starting with, what is your favorite part of what you do every day?
I think just building great relationships with the most wonderful people. I don't know if everyone feels this way, but I have the greatest clients. We laugh, we cry, we're superhuman with each other. And just to like having that dedicated space to be attuned and present with other humans is, I find really lovely. I also just love that this work allows such variety. As I mentioned at the beginning, that I write, I supervise. I've in the past done courses and groups, and I've definitely taken advantage of that flexibility and variety. So that when I've started to feel even the smallest signs of burnout, I take that chance to change things up and bring in more of what's working at that point, which for me right now is doing phone supervision while walking in nature. Um, just realizing what my body needs most has been really nice.
That's great. What would you say is something that trauma has taught you?
What I would say is working with trauma has taught me the importance of the body in healing. From a somatic perspective, we see the fight, flight, freeze, bond energy as survival energy that's stuck in the body. And so, working with the body to feel safe again, to connect with aliveness, to feel connection, and to be able to process those stuck experiences through the body becomes really important. It's not enough to say to someone, "Oh, you're safe now." Their nervous system has to feel that that's true. And that can take a lot of orienting and grounding to help them get there.
Mm. This has become one of the most popular questions on the podcast because people get to add tools to their toolbox.
Mm.
But do you have any favorite trauma resources that you like to recommend?
Okay, I think my favorite, because I'm really into the sort of like, okay, what practices can I utilize for my nervous system type of resources. I like Linda Graham's book called Resilience. It has about 100 different exercises, and some of them just small, couple, 30-second practices, other longer ones. So most people will find a bit of something that they need there. Um, My Grandmother's Hands is a very beautiful book about trauma. And then I haven't usually been into memoirs because it's a lot to, see trauma all day and then read about it in the evening. But I did read Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I found that quite beautiful. Yeah, yeah, just so, she really brings the humanity of the person who experienced it. You can see the fullness of who she is as a writer and an artist. So that one's good. And I just started reading What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. I have not gotten to the part where she's doing the healing work yet. So the first half is a bit difficult to listen or read through, but I'm promised that the end has the healing journey aspect. Oh, I will also add that if it's helpful to you, I can share some of my own resources. I do have a handbook that I wrote on vicarious trauma and burnout for settlement professionals. And then I have just a little healing trauma toolkit as well, with a couple of the grounding and orienting tools that I use the most.
That's great. I also really appreciate that you gave us books that haven't been mentioned on this podcast. It's always the same ones. Some of my favorites you mentioned, I just started reading What My Bones Know, so I'm very excited to get into this a little bit more. It was recommended to me as well, but those are great because these are not books that we've actually had before. It's always the same ones, as you can
Okay.
imagine, which always
Yeah.
get brought up, but which are always great. But I think people really love to add something new. So super appreciate your recommendations there. And there will be links to all of these books and resources in the show notes as well. Um, Again, thank you. This conversation has been really informative and I hope really, really helpful for people that are listening to this. Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners before we close?
I think that was everything that I wanted to share. And I'm just really glad to have shared this space with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really want to thank Nicole for being on our show. And for more information about her and her practice, as well as the resources mentioned, you can check out our show notes. The Breaking Free Foundation offers therapy grants for trauma survivors in Alberta, and we also host 2 free support meetings a month. One is in person in Calgary, and one is online. For more information on trauma therapy and our organization, please visit us online at breakingfreefoundation.ca. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share. That's all for now. Stay well.